stealth gameplay and I have had a tumultuous relationship over the years. I remember when I was younger, I couldn't stand stealth. And for the longest time I thought I would never really find access to this type of gameplay. The things I associated with stealth were mostly just boredom and frustration. Boredom because stealth often means having to wait somewhere to learn enemy patrol routes, as well as waiting for them to walk into a position where it's advantageous for you to make your move. And frustration whenever said move didn't succeed because of ambiguous enemy perception. However, over the years I've come to really enjoy stealth gameplay, especially whenever it's presented as an alternative to action-focused gameplay in my beloved immersive sims. The reason why I came to hate it in the first place was through non-stealth games. Back in the early 2000s it seemed like many games that were otherwise action-focused implemented a couple of forced stealth missions to mix up the formula and provide variety. Unfortunately, if a game is generally not about stealth, implementing gameplay aspects from that genre often turn out less than stellar. It's like those first-person shooter segments from Banjo-Tooie. It's not what the game was designed for and much less what the audience of that game came for. I hated stealth because of all the ways developers used it in non-stealth games, and that's a real shame. Those developers actually did me a real disservice by depriving me of the joy I could have had playing genuinely good stealth games with rewarding mechanics by instead providing me with their crappy take on the genre in a misguided attempt at added variety. That is not to say that I now think all pure stealth games are great. No, that's where today's subject comes into play. Now, I'm not going to bury the lead here. République isn't a terrible game. In fact, I'd say I had fun with it for an ever so slim majority of my time with it. This is actually where the game's episodic nature comes in handy, because the first 3 episodes were pretty damn good. The game only falters during the final 2 episodes, both in terms of gameplay as well as, and in particular, in the story department. But before we get into the narrative, first a bit about the gameplay. République's flavor of stealth stems from a fairly simplistic implementation, probably owing in no small part to the initial target platform. République was primarily built for phones and tablets. It was supposed to be an attempt to make a quote-unquote real game for those platforms instead of the minimalistic 5-minute time wasters you play on the toilet or the bus. A few games with similar ambitions have been made over the years, but as far as I can tell, it has become clear that phones and tablets are neither equipped for, nor are their audiences willing to invest the time and effort necessary to play 10+ hour narrative games with more than simple touch controls for a few actions. République has since also been released on a few consoles as well as on PC, the latter of which is where I've played it on. In République, you play the role of an unseen, unnamed person. No, I'm not kidding here. You might think that your character is supposed to be Hope, this young lady who you're guiding through these levels, ideally without detection. But no, it's made abundantly clear that you're not controlling her, even though that is factually what you're doing. You're actually just some random person on the other end of a phone call who for some reason has the magical ability to hack into all the security cameras inside the compound that Hope tries to escape from. Put a pin in that for the coming discussion of the narrative. Anyway, the point of the game is to hop between cameras to scout out a path ahead of Hope and guide her through the level so she can avoid enemies, pick up items and other collectibles. Basically, République is framed as one giant escort quest. The game is mostly pretty easy if you simply choose to follow the critical path and avoid enemies altogether. Guards have absolutely no peripheral vision, and even alerted guards can at times be evaded by just running away and hiding in a locker. And even if they catch you, your punishment is just getting sent into a holding cell that you can easily break out of to try again. They do take away all the defensive items you've gathered up to that point, so there is a bit of punishment, but not much. And you usually only lose a little bit of progress that way, because the holding cells are generously sprinkled around those levels. Speaking of those defensive items, there are a few ways you can make things even easier. You can find pepper spray lying around which can be used to temporarily disable alerted guards, and later on you can find tasers to take them out for good. And to the game's credit, if Hope gets spotted, she automatically employs these items whenever a guard catches her, so no hectic flipping through your inventory. But I assume that the developers noticed that their stealth game was rather monotonous and easy if your only goal is to get past the guards undetected. To provide a bit more of a challenge, the game also gives you the ability to pickpocket the patrolling guards. Sometimes you can acquire additional pepper spray or tasers, but most of them only carry collectibles. However, these collectibles really don't serve any purpose whatsoever. This game was made by people who used to work in AAA development and left that environment for greener indie pastures. And I guess as a way of trying to appeal to other indie game fans, and especially indie developers, they opted to make these collectibles be floppy disks of other popular popular indie titles, with one character gushing tirelessly about how great these games are. I've seen this kind of stuff in other games as well, where an indie game name drops a couple of other indie titles for some reason. To me, it always reeks of a desperate attempt to join a perceived cool kids club by trying to stroke the egos of established developers. And a quick hot tip for any developers out there: never remind your players of other, better games they could be playing instead of yours. And having these collectibles as a sole reward for pickpocketing guards is only an incentive for achievement hunters. There are also other collectibles you can pick up that aren't as unrelated as those other video games. Since the game is about data collection and surveillance, you can find a ton of books that deal with totalitarian dystopias or otherwise societal issues, and even a few other ones that deal with philosophical ideas. This is mostly used as a platform for the villain of République to talk dismissively about both the novel in question as well as its author. That would be fine, even though it's a bit of an exercise in sniffing your own farts by pretentiously name-dropping all the books you've read, as well as hinging the entire exploration of the villain's philosophy on the audience knowing what all these books are about. But for this to work, however, you need to present an alternative philosophy that would contrast with all the ideas of these books the villain tears up. And that's where I'll necessarily have to go into the narrative. As usual, spoiler alert, because I don't think I'm able to critique the narrative without talking about specifics. Skip to this time code for the conclusion. So the whole game takes place in a location called Metamorphosis. Funny how the villain of the piece hates Kafka but calls this place Metamorphosis. Anyway, Metamorphosis is portrayed as an oppressive totalitarian environment where students get indoctrinated with the teachings of its founder Kenichiro Treglazov through his eponymous manifesto. But that's really all that seemingly happens in this place. Metamorphosis doesn't seem to be an entire society, even though it does have a newspaper for the prerequisite disinformation that runs rampant in it. It also, for some reason, has a revolutionary uprising. But again, Metamorphosis doesn't seem to be anything beyond a place where children live and get educated. I guess the chief failing is that the story of République starts in medias res and never goes back to fill in the rest. Attempts are made with the many, oh so many audio logs you get to hear, but they don't paint a clear picture and only provide disjointed fragments that the author wants you to piece together. And I have no idea how you even get to hear them, because picking up these books or even just looking at or picking up random objects triggers these lengthy monologues and dialogues. Guys, seriously, if you can't fit your narrative into your actual game, scale back the narrative. Otherwise, this stuff needs to happen more organically within the confines of the actual story that happens while we're playing the game. Stopping gameplay to listen to minutes of audio logs is just boring as hell. And hiding all this stuff in collectibles or random pickups only ensures that half your audience won't get all the information to piece together the story you're trying to tell. Or worse, come away with the wrong interpretation of the story because you chose to make certain things optional. In fact, I'm not even sure I have the entire picture. I tried reading up on the stuff I've missed because I'm certainly not going back to play through the game a second time with a walkthrough on my second monitor, but information seems to be sparse, and the few fans the game does seem to have couldn't even be bothered to set up a decently navigable wiki. So from what I could gather, Metamorphosis only houses children, the security personnel keeping them in line, and a few custodial staff, all of whom are under constant surveillance and targeted with endless propaganda. The children don't have names, they only get referred to by a string of numbers and letters. Our main character, Hope, has the designation 390H. Get it? If you mirror the string and replace the numbers with the letters they kind of look like, they spell out hope. Cute. Now, what initially sounds like a cliché boilerplate shorthand for your typical THX 1138-esque dystopia later on actually changes meaning a bit, because those numbers and letters aren't just incremental designators, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Anyway, Hope gets detained at the start of the game for having violated the rules of Metamorphosis by allegedly reading the quote-unquote tainted copy of the manifesto that got distributed throughout Metamorphosis by the revolutionary figure David Zager, voiced by none other than Solid Snake himself. Hope also steals the phone of Mireille Prideaux, the administrator of the school. That phone allows her to contact you to ask you to help guide her to her escape. For the first 3 episodes, this is rather straightforward. It's mostly just linear levels with a few guards walking around. Over time, the number of guards increases, some of their patrol routes get more roundabout, and some guards are introduced that can't be tased or pepper sprayed. There's not much in terms of story going on in the first 3 episodes. Much of the plot relies on filling in the details through the aforementioned audio logs. Only towards the end of the 3rd episode does anything of note happen. Because you, the player, aren't Hope's only ally in this. Frederick Cooper, one of the security officers, also tries to help her get out of metamorphosis. To that end, he serves as the tutorial voice and is generally the one giving you your objectives. The third episode centers around reaching an elevator that goes up to the surface, since metamorphosis seems to be located entirely underground somewhere in the North Pacific. Only this elevator is predictably guarded by 2 security officers. Your job is to get them sent away by exposing some of their behaviors that run counter to Treglazov's ideals. Once you do that, they get replaced by a single other security guard, which again you have to dig up dirt on. With the first 2 you get their actual names, but with this last one you curiously only get an employee number. If you've been paying attention, you'll have noticed that Cooper mentioned at some point that he was being called off his station. Now forgive me for being observant enough to have seen this heavily foreshadowed twist coming a mile away when it turns out that the one guy you just collected dirt on is also the guy who's trying to help you out. Oops. After witnessing Cooper getting rounded up, Hope manages to get into the elevator, but then breaks down on the way up for having unwittingly betrayed an ally. I'm not sure how well that twist sits with me, because again, it was too heavily foreshadowed for my taste, so it didn't really have the intended surprising effect. But that's not the only twist it has ready for you, because this is where République springs its most devious trap. Episode 4 starts with the phone lying on the ground outside in the rain. After a while it gets picked up by someone who looks a lot like Hope, but she's missing her scars and the prominent glowing necklace she's wearing. And conspicuously the subtitles show her as just 390. Only numbers, no letter designation. And she also exhibits a markedly different personality, which might lead you to believe that Hope went through what the game calls recalibration. In the game, the villain refers to all the children as precals or pre-calibrated people who eventually go through a process called calibration. If something afterwards should put them on a deviant path, they get recalibrated to put them back on track, but this also erases their memories. So at first I assumed that this had happened to Hope. Only during this chapter you get to learn that something called mirrors exist. Again, this is a bit of a failure of the author to clearly communicate their concepts, because mirror is just an arbitrary synonym for clone in this world. For some reason people insist on reinventing the wheel by calling things something other than the established name. See also the many zombie movies who try to find a way around calling their undead zombies. You learn throughout the episode that there are a bunch of clones in these laboratories where 2 scientists conduct experiments on them. The goal of these experiments is to encode data within human DNA, basically turning these children into massive hard drives. It's unclear if the original children these clones are based on in Metamorphosis are of natural origin or if they are completely synthetic. Regardless, the point here is that in episode 4 you are not guiding Hope, you are helping a random other clone from the surface who herself managed to apparently escape her confines. Now I'm making this seem way more straightforward than it is. The whole DNA storage concept isn't told to you directly in this episode. You'll have to notice all the conveniently placed TV sets lying around that equally conveniently just so happen to have a few seconds from some actual legit videos from Harvard University playing on them that explain the concept. And this is only made harder since the episode takes a lot of inspiration from the early Resident Evil games in addition to the already fixed camera angles by introducing a Nemesis-esque enemy that stalks you from place to place and has an uncanny and completely unfair ability of teleporting around the place. He's the only enemy in the entire chapter and a constant nuisance to navigate around, so you'd be entirely forgiven if you don't take the necessary time to find all the collectibles to explain what the hell is going on. This is also where the game stops the pretense of failure only meaning you'll get put into a holding cell as a means to show you that you're not really permanently locked out of progress as an in-universe explanation for why the story keeps going on. If Mammoth, the giant stalking the girl around the level, catches her, he just pounds her into the dirt, the screen fades to black and the game resumes as if nothing had happened. Why even bother trying to explain your fail state in a diegetic manner if you're just dropping it halfway through the game? But the kicker here is that the entire episode is absolutely pointless in terms of driving the plot forward. Since you now know that a clone of Hope has found her phone and she's nowhere to be seen on the surface, it's safe to assume that she got caught after she had her breakdown. So the whole point of the episode is to get the phone back to her so her adventure can continue. To that end, you get to do an endless back and forth with Mammoth, as well as navigate the most frustrating level design yet, since a portion of it happens in a maze and the fixed camera angles never lend themselves to getting a complete picture of its layout and frequently end up disorienting you. There must have been a better way to implement this entire expository stuff around clones and DNA data storage. This is just confusing your audience by having them guide a clone of your main character without telling them, as well as roundabout levels that end with the clone dying at the hands of the villain so he can bring the phone back to Hope himself. off. Yeah, you heard that right, the entire detour is pointless because the clone dies either way and Treglazov is dumb enough to start up a phone call at the start of the next episode. He does so to do a Bond villain speech about his entire plan leading up to him trying to execute Hope and only getting stopped by Zager conveniently starting up his revolution at the same moment. You know, something you as a player and Hope as the protagonist had no hand in conceiving or propelling forward. Anyway, the final episode is about sticking it to Treglazov. You have a choice of either following Zager's plan and be violent about it, or if you want to be non-violent, Mireille Prideaux's plan. Prideaux actually turns out to be Zager's ally who just kept up the charade of being subservient to Treglazov. Her plan is to erase the bogus criminal records of all the guards. If you've paid attention to all the passports of the guards you can read, you'll have noticed that every last one of them has a criminal record, which at the start suggests that you're dealing with seasoned criminals here. Turns out that almost all of them are fabricated in order to make sure that none of the guards start rebelling. The point of metamorphosis is to collect data on everybody on the planet. That's why they need human DNA to encode that much information. And if you control all the information, it's easy to fabricate a few lies here and there. I actually like this little nuance. It doesn't really change much about the guards since they're all identical faceless henchmen with the exception of Cooper, but it's a nice effort nonetheless. Once you either arm the guards or erase their fabricated criminal records, the rebellion can begin in full and your final task is to erase all the data that has been collected in regular storage as a sort of final blow to Treglazov. This is easily the nadir of the episode because it sends you into a kind of pseudo-virtual reality setting. It doesn't tell you what you have to do there, you just have to intuit that you have the ability to fly around the cluster of spheres and that the yellow ones represent additional audio logs. Once you listen to a few of them, the data forms a globe that allows you to listen into a few conversations by other clones of the 390 series, who apparently now all live out in the world. Why? Why are these clones released into the world? They're obviously mind-wiped, but many of the conversations deal with them remembering what happened on Metamorphosis. Maybe that's connected with you doing something in that central server, who knows, but it's never really made clear. And here is where the resolution gets a bit murky. The whole time Treglazov has been touting something called the arrival, some kind of specific important date. Turns out that that's only the day when some kind of contract between him and the US gets signed. It's never made clear to what end, or maybe it is and I just didn't find the necessary audio logs. Just after the exchange happens, an explosion goes off in Metamorphosis and one of Treglazov's underlings explains to him that all the data is lost. And I have no idea why. Treglazov mentions that his directive to recalibrate everybody meant that all the data is gone, but I thought it's inside their DNA, not in what they're taught in Metamorphosis. Better yet, Hope as the only precal that managed to get out is now the only remaining backup of all that data, even though we just established that clone A through J are out there and their DNA is still intact. The game gives you a final choice to either go with Prideaux and Zager, join Treglazov for some reason, or apply for asylum in the US via the Vice Admiral who's also present there. Except it's not really a choice, since Hope decides to jump overboard and presumably kill herself in the process either way, regardless of what you choose. This whole ending makes no sense to me. What is Treglazov's plan here? I get the whole global surveillance theme, that's what most of the game is about, but Treglazov's act as a totalitarian dictator is only one piece to the puzzle. I don't think he actually believes in the ideals he teaches, and his insistence on keeping tainted materials away from the clones is silly when they then still get mind-wiped and released into the wild where they will inevitably encounter all these tainted ideas either way. Then again, Treglazov's philosophy is entirely obscure. He has a lot to say about other philosophies and that they're bad, but he never offers a valid alternate viewpoint. I mean, the narrative falls apart the second you ask the question "and then what?" to every proposed plot point. Treglazov wants to store all the data in the world in the DNA of clones. And then what? Treglazov teaches these clones in his never specified philosophy and mind-wipes all the deviants. And then what? Treglazov mind-wipes them anyway and releases them into the world. And then what? Nothing. Apparently he sells the data collection and surveillance to governments, but the villain's motivation remains entirely unclear. That isn't even going into who the fuck Zager is supposed to be and how he and Mireille got involved in starting the whole rebellion. That's the problem with in medias res storytelling. If you don't bother to show how it all started, you leave massive gaping holes in your narrative. A narrative that doesn't explain why the events we see unfold the way they do, which again almost never rely on the presence of the supposed protagonists, and that does its darndest to make sure you have to work for every scrap of information you do end up collecting. Was this really the goal here? To create a game where if you don't go out of your way to collect everything, you might end up being confused by the whole switcheroo in playable characters in episode 4 and what happens by the end? Never mind that your role as the guy on the other end of the phone line is never addressed at all. Unfortunately, République isn't a game that elegantly marries narrative and gameplay. The story ends up being nonsensical and relies too much on hidden audio logs, and even then it only paints an incomplete picture. The gameplay is a bit better, and I'd say it's pretty enjoyable for the first 3 episodes. It's nothing groundbreaking, but it's competently put together, at least whenever Hope decides to actually follow your commands properly. But then again, episode 4 is such a slog, and episode 5 is just a retread of the previous section that only serves as a vehicle to deliver the bewilderingly nonsensical final act of a story that should have ended 2 episodes ago. Sure, if Hope would have gotten away as the end of episode 3 suggests, the game would have just been a stealth game about a dystopian micronation out in the North Pacific. But it would have been infinitely better than the narrative clusterfuck it ends up being after the latter 2 episodes.